Ukraine agreed to a 30-day peace ceasefire with Russia. Do you think there's any chance of this actually happening?
Well, I can't say there's no chance. I think it's highly unlikely. The Russians have stated again and again, in no uncertain terms they're not going to accept a ceasefire, absent a larger a peace agreement. And there's no larger peace agreement here. It's just a ceasefire. All that the U.S. got out of Ukraine was an agreement to this 30-day ceasefire. Previously, Ukraine had agreed to the French proposal, Macron's proposal, to have, let's say, he called it an air and sea ceasefire, but to allow the fighting to continue on the ground. And this time, what the concession, if you want to call it, that the Ukrainians made was to agree to a ground ceasefire as well. That's all they agreed to. And they immediately got resumption of supplies and continuation of intelligence support. It's not really clear how much intelligence support had been cut off earlier, but I think there may have been at least a partial cutoff. Anyway, they're back to where they were. They've agreed to this 30-day ceasefire, which makes a lot of sense from their point of view. I mean, I've been arguing, and I know others have been arguing for a while, that it really, from the Ukrainian point of view, it makes a great deal of sense to agree to a ceasefire, because they know that the Russians have stated again and again that they are not interested in a ceasefire. They've been criticized for being an obstacle to peace. The Ukrainians have been. But by agreeing to the ceasefire, they, as everybody has been saying, the ball is in the Russian court. And it's like, and then now if the Russians reject the ceasefire, then the Russians are the obstacle to peace. And, that's where we are. That's what was always going to happen. That's what I was saying earlier. So I think they finally, maybe because they got Zelensky out of there and the Americans applied this pressure, it wasn't that hard to convince the Ukrainians to do something that was eminently sensible from their point of view. Now, from the Russian point of view, it really doesn't make sense.
Right. I mean, right now, with the collapse in Kursk, the severe lack of manpower, the cutoff of intelligence and military aid to Ukraine, if you're Russia, you might be looking at, it's over. We want a total surrender at this point, right? There's not much left that Ukraine can do. Do you think that that's what they will try to push for, that Russia will be more maximalist in its demands? Or is it possible that they could say, all right, we can work with this 30-day ceasefire, but with stipulations like demilitarization? Because obviously what they're concerned about is Ukraine rearming during this time and building up fortifications to just prolong the conflict even longer. So obviously Russia is not going to allow for that to happen. If there's some type of guarantee that won't happen, that they do demilitarize and they can create kind of a buffer zone, is that possible?
Well, yeah, it's certainly possible. I think it's quite unlikely. Partly we've got to look at actually Ukrainian behavior both before and after the ceasefire agreement in Jeddah. On the morning that the ceasefire was agreed to, yesterday morning, just prior to the beginning of the negotiations in Jeddah, the Ukrainians launched the largest drone attack that they've carried out during the entire conflict, the conflict beginning 3 years ago. It was approximately 340 drones were launched at Russia. Now, it looks like virtually all of them were shot down, but all of them, were targeting civilian areas. One actually made it into Moscow and struck an apartment building. And then somewhere outside of Moscow, one came down, I think, in a parking lot of a food factory and killed, I think, 2 or 3 people, civilians. And, none of these drones were anywhere close to a military target. 6 were shot down, actually, very close to the Kursk nuclear power plant. That's something that they've attacked in the past. So this, we have to say, this was on the morning, again, of the negotiations in Jeddah. And this was a wide-scale terrorist operation directed against Russia. I mean, that's the only way to describe it. When you're just going after civilian targets, there's no military purpose to this. It's just to kill civilians, to terrorize civilians. That's the very definition of terrorism. And then just after, and there were some really tragic attacks on civilians in the days leading up to the negotiations. For example, I think in Kherson, there was a market that was targeted and several people were killed. It was just a market. It was a Saturday, farmer's market, something like that. And the missile came down right in the middle of it and killed several civilians and injured many more. And then the day after the negotiations, which is to say today, last night, there was an attack on civilians in the Kursk region that, again, killed civilians. So these are all terrorist attacks. There's no military target. There's really no argument that you can make that there was a military target. This was pure terrorism. And they did it both before and after, immediately before and immediately after the negotiations. So the Russians looking at this, they would say, have these people changed? Are they actually interested in peace? Or is this just something, this is something clearly to their benefit. They get a continuation of supplies from the U.S. They're losing, and in fact, part of the front is collapsing as we speak in Kursk, right? And so, of course, it makes sense for them to agree to a temporary ceasefire. Okay, they can stabilize the lines. They can get another, 30 days of supplies coming in. They can build some fortifications, then go at it again. It's entirely to the benefit of the Ukrainians. Now, and, especially I think in Kursk, because there is a chance, we don't know exactly what the Russians intend to do. But as, the line has crumbled there, the Ukrainian soldiers are fleeing. Sucha has been taken. That was the only town of any size in the Kursk area that the Ukrainians had occupied. And so they're just a remainder, very close now to the Ukrainian border. And they seem to be almost without exception, just fleeing. So it's over. It's over in Kursk. Now the Russians are already into Sumy, which is the Ukrainian province right across the border. And many think that they just may continue. And, they have the advantage. There isn't any sort of, stable front there. They can keep on pushing. And so why at this moment, it makes every bit of, lots of sense from the Ukrainian point of view. Let's right now call it, ceasefire, but it obviously doesn't make any sense from the Russian point of view.
Right. It's just like getting that fatal blow and they're like, time out. Stop.
Yeah, right. Exactly. Right. So I think it's, again, the Russians have made it real clear they are not interested in a ceasefire. I think it's highly unlikely. I know there are Russians that are worried that the Russian government, that Putin will agree to one, because he's agreed to ceasefires in similar circumstances in the past. Way back, I think it was in 2015. There were many, the Ukrainians were surrounded, encircled, a situation similar to what we're seeing in Sucha. And at that time, Merkel, rushed to Moscow, and Putin agreed to a ceasefire. He told the militia there, hey, let's, I think we can work out a deal. Let's stop fighting. And that saved that portion of the Ukrainian army. It was, that's territory that would have been won by the Donbass militias. But it was saved by this ceasefire, which led to the Minsk Accords, which the other side never kept up. In the end, they just used it to buy time to, for a war down the road. So, and that's not the only instance. We've talked about some of the other ones, but there are a lot of Russians say, okay, it was Putin, was like Charlie Brown in the football. I don't know if you know that cartoon, but it was the big deal. What else? Right? Okay, yeah. I guess people still know about that. It's just like they keep on. And there's a fear that he will be naive again. Now, I don't think so. It's just like he has been very clear about what Russia's conditions are. Everybody around him, Lavrov, Peskov, they've said again and again. and that they're not going to fall for this. And he himself has said, okay, yeah, I was naive in the past. I shouldn't have believed them. And I think he really understands that. So I think it's highly, highly unlikely that they will agree to the ceasefire. And I think they'll try to do it in a way, they'll reject it, but maybe not outright. They may attach some conditions, say, okay, yeah, we're willing to do, but the Ukrainians do have to do this. The Ukrainians will reject that, and it'll maybe by doing that they can muddy the water somewhat and make it, less clear that they're the ones, rejecting the ceasefire. It won't be as easy to blame them for it. We'll see.
Do you think, the reasoning behind these drone attacks right around these ceasefire negotiation talks in Jeddah? Why would they do that?
Yeah, well, if you're really interested in negotiations, you don't do something like that. I wouldn't think. It may be that it had nothing to do with negotiations. It may be just a kind of an effort to distract from what's going on in Kursk. We've seen this before. It just seems like often when a section of the front collapses, Avdiivka, whatever, you do see an uptick in these kind of drone attacks or other terrorist attacks. So it may be because of Kursk. But maybe in the minds of the Ukrainians, they're thinking that, okay, yeah, we're showing that we can terrorize the Russians, and this will help to bring the Russians to the table. I mean, that's actually been their stated justification for a lot of their attacks in the past, and say that, yeah, we're bringing it to the Russians. We're killing Russian civilians. That makes Russia suffer. That'll put pressure on the Russian government, and perhaps they actually believe that. Maybe some of them do.
That's pretty dumb, right?
Yeah,
just thinking them doing this gives Russia the excuse to say, no, we can't agree to this ceasefire. They're engaging in terrorist attacks on our country. I feel like this will backfire on them, right? This will give ammunition to Russia to say, no, we're not going to agree to a ceasefire. This is just another reason why we can't, because of these terrorist attacks.
Yeah.
Don't you agree?
No, I think that's true. I mean, the effect of these different attacks and of the Kursk incursion itself has always been to actually unite the Russians and to increase support for the military effort there, which is not surprising. But either again, the Ukrainians are just so blinded. I think they're really just so blinded by their hatred of the Russians that I think some of them, like Budanov, and he said this outright. I mean, he just takes pleasure in killing Russians. He just wants to kill Russians wherever they are, and that's part of what drives these attacks. He said, "Well, we can't defeat them on the battlefield, but we can kill Russians in parking lots and in marketplaces."